Steph, your phone.
Need your coffee?
Yeah, it's way better than that. We have a World War II veteran that I knew. He was in Germany.
See, you're right up here. What's yours? His best friend, he loved a guy named Gus Withelm, who was an SPD pilot, and he took him up in the airplane. Took him up and
Very nice to meet you. How are you doing? I am.
I know it's fun.
So I work with Jeremy in the Institute. And I'm a historian.
Well, he's in the back. Right, he's in the back. He's in the back seat. In the back seat. And there's one going off the front end. And there he is. That's Gus. He was his real favorite pilot. So bring back memories. We got lots of.
Yeah, it's nighttime scenes. I mean, amazing.
Oh, I wouldn't think so.
There's a, I have the link, yeah. It is so much better than just one scene. Thank you so much for having me. I dear Margo. I met you in the World War II. The World War II. This is,
Yeah. I mean, on Saturday, people might be rather. You know what? I think dedicated. I'm sure we'll have some good questions and people will be. Really? Wow. What was the topic? It's hard to get. People just go nuts over churches. Yeah. I am originally from Pennsylvania. which is very different from New Orleans. A job, yes. So my husband is also a historian, and he teaches strategy and history at Maxwell Air Force Base. So he's civilian, but he works for the Air Force. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
12 years in the United States Congress.
Wow.
Now, that is
Yeah. Yeah.
and working on a master's degree in history.
Really? Oh, that's good for him. Is there an area of history? That's great. That's good to hear. Is he like World War II history, or is there? Yeah. Well, it's a big subject, so lots of things that he could be. There's absolutely.
What's that?
It'll still be great. We'll have a good time.
On the university history students.
No, sleepy. Yes, they're sleepy. Steph. Yep, I go by Steph. Yeah. Someone says Stephanie, it reminds me of my mom or grandma yelling at me. So I hear Stephanie.
Very good.
They bring out the middle name if I'm really bad. Stephanie.
And then Mike called and said, "Hey, you want to work down here?" I'm like, "I do." So a couple weeks later, there I was.
He's from Delaware. Yeah, we met in grad school at the University of Maryland. Really? Where at? It's by the beach? Sherwood Beach? Yeah. I'm Steph. I'm from the museum, so very nice to meet you.
The girl with Jeremy, historian,
No, he teaches at Maxwell Air Force Base. Yep.
Yes.
We did an event at the museum back in June, and I interviewed Churchill's granddaughter, Emma Soames. That place was packed. It was packed. We had a big room with all the planes. We interviewed Churchill's granddaughter. Yes. She was very nice and great. Okay.
unveiling of Paul's sculpture.
Yeah.
The symposium is the next morning.
Yeah.
That was the symposium where we had to bring the engineers.
Yeah.
That was fun. Because that's one of the describes about
Weather is not.
which is disappointing.
I know, well, somebody who puts on events, by the time everybody gets here, so nobody's gonna.
You're gonna give me a card today.
So they just figure nobody comes.
Okay.
They were hoping for 60, but they're One of them when I bought it.
On what stage?
I'm sure he is.
Oh, okay. I'm gonna call my wife up. Yeah, I'm gonna call her. She can do it on her laptop. Open channel.
Oh, okay.
Good morning. Can y'all hear me? Good morning and welcome. My name is Luann Greenwald. I'm the director of the Hilliard Art Museum, and we are delighted to welcome you to the symposium this morning. We're excited to be partnering with the National World War II Museum again. Special thanks to Jamey Clement, who really guided us through developing and implementing this symposium. Jamey is the Director of Conferences and Symposia at the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy at the National World War II Museum. And I'm so grateful, Jamey, for your help. Thank you. I also want to say a special thanks to our curator, Ben Hickey, and Christina Lake from our team at the Hilliard Art Museum. They've been incredible collaborators on this symposium and really appreciate their great work. And also a special thanks to Larry Marino from Oates & Marino. Thanks to their sponsorship, we're able to offer this wonderful program for free. And Larry, we have a little gift for you if you wouldn't mind coming forward. And finally, I want to say thank you to Acadiana Open Channel. They're actually live streaming the event today, and they'll be broadcasting the presentation to make it available to a much broader audience. So thank you, AOC. I want to turn this over to Jamey. Before I do, just a couple of small pieces of practical information. Restrooms are just across the patio through the double doors and to the left. And want to remind everybody to silence your cell phones. And I'm going to turn this over to Jamey. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Luann. Thank you also for pinning the responsibility of any displeasure today solely on me. If you all don't like the program, it's not the exhibit's fault. It's not the Hilliard Art Museum's fault. It's not the World War II Museum's fault, and certainly not our speaker's fault. Luann has made it all on me. It's great to see you all here. I'd like to specifically point out, Luann, this is a great partnership that developed long ago, pre-COVID, in January of 2020, where we worked with the Hilliard Art Museum for their Winston Churchill exhibit on a symposium similar to today's. Ben, great job with the exhibit. Christina, who's not here because she's taking care of things behind the scenes, thank you for everything you do. Paul, Madeline, you guys are champions throughout Louisiana, throughout the Gulf South, and throughout the world. Thank you very much for your support of both institutions. Larry and Ann, I'm going to say thank you as well. Putting on programs at the museum back in New Orleans, we couldn't do without the support of our friends, our donors, our members, and I know what it takes, and you guys are great. So thanks to Oates & Marino and Larry. Who are supporters? Let's see a show of hands. Who supports the Hilliard Art Museum? Great. Not everybody yet. Nobody leaves till everybody signs up. I'm not going to ask for membership. Who's been to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans? Great. Come back. We'll keep the lights on for you. Throughout history, war has been chronicled by art and artists. If you've been to Rome, you've seen Trajan's Column. If you've been to Normandy, maybe you've seen the beaches of Normandy for D-Day, but hopefully you stopped to go see the Bayeux Tapestry, chronicling the Battle of Hastings in 1066. In World War I, We had John Singer Sargent. In the Civil War, we had combat artists. And in the Revolutionary War, we had John Trumbull, who was basically quit his job and went to go join Washington to serve as an aide-de-camp, and was sort of documenting the enemy ramparts. And he used those memories to become one of the most famous painters in American history after the war. And then in World War II, things really escalated. We had about over 100 combat artists that were covering actions and a lot of inaction, because as anybody in the military will say, it's a bunch of hurry up and wait. But they were all over the world, over 100 of these individuals, making over 10,000 sketches, paintings, drawings, etc. And today we are here to hear about perhaps the most famous, but unfortunately not famous enough. That's why we want to do this program and this exhibit. We want to make him more famous. Tom Lea. We have a wonderful day. I think it's a wonderful day, as Luann said, because I helped put the program together, so I hope you all agree by the end of the day. We have a wonderful day where we're going to give you little snippets of Tom, his life, his work, and the war he fought in. We'll have an overview of the Pacific Theater brought to you by my colleague, John Curatola. We'll then have a conversation between my other colleague, Dr. Steph Hennershitz, and Nell, the granddaughter of Claire Chenault, who, if you've seen the exhibit, you see that stunning portrait of that grizzled gentleman who helped lead the war in the China-Burma-India theater. Then we'll have a wonderful roundtable that has friends and associates of Tom Lea talking about Tom the man. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker of the day. Dr. John Curatola joined the National World War II Museum as military historian back in August of 2022, not too long ago. And he came to us from the Command General Staff College. He's a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps Reserve, retired. You're no longer in the reserve. You don't want that burden. Retired lieutenant colonel. Received his PhD from Kansas and has 2 books out, working on a 3rd and maybe 4th right now. Bigger Bombs for a Brighter Future and Autumn of Our Discontent. John's going to give this overview of Tom Lea and the war in which he fought. John?
Thank you for that introduction, Jeremy. I appreciate that. If you will allow me, I will, in the words of George Washington, I have grown old and blind in service of my country. And since working at the World War II Museum, I've become a little bit rounder, too. So kind of one of the dangers of working in New Orleans. Again, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Pacific War. I'm not going to give you a history lesson. That would take too long, and you're not students, but to talk to you about the environment that the Pacific was. And I spent 4 years of my Marine Corps career there in the Pacific, and it's a unique environment to operate, and even more unique given the situation of the war from 1941 to 1945. And what I'm going to talk about is the nature of the Pacific War. And when you're in the Pacific, it's really characterized by the geography. The war itself was very naval-centric for a lot of reasons. And at its core, the Second World War is a race war between 2 civilizations that don't understand each other, and quite frankly didn't want to understand each other during this time. So I'm going to kind of provide some of this in terms of a context for you before we launch into the rest of Tom's wonderful art. How big is the Pacific Ocean? Well, there you go. All the land masses in the world can fit within the Pacific Basin. 63.8 square miles, 32% of the Earth's surface, spans 12 time zone, and it's got enough water to cover the entire planet of Mars. So when you think about the Pacific, you have to consider distance, the tyranny of distance. And why that's so important is because then, as now, America fights away games. We don't play home games for good reasons. But you have to get there. And that requires power projection. That requires a naval fleet, an air fleet, to cover these vast distances. And during the Pacific War, the Americans, more so than the Japanese, were fighting on what I will term the fringes of empire, as far as you could possibly fight with these huge lines of logistics. And that really shaped a number of the operations during the Second World War, because you had to send men and material across these vast distances. And it makes a difference in your ability to project combat power. When the Japanese strike Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, they are striking the greatest industrial power in the world. Japanese industrial output was 10% that of the United States. And again, the United States can build ships and aircraft carriers and airplanes to reach the Far East. The Japanese cannot keep up with the Americans in this regard. So this idea of distance really shapes the way the war is progressing. And when you look at this particular map, this shows you the Japanese lines of communication, their defensive perimeter for much of the war. Because Japan's an island nation, and she doesn't have a lot of natural resources. That's why she goes into Manchuria in 1931. It's why she goes into China in 1937. It's why she's attacking the West Indies there, because there's oil, wood, bauxite, other rare earth materials that she needs for a modern industrial military and a modern industrial society, because Japan doesn't have these resources. So as a result, the war really becomes a war based upon sea lines of communication. You have to get the raw materials from point A to point B, and interdicting these sea lines of communication are important. Interdicting these sea lines of communication are imperative. Once we start reducing the Japanese ability to supply their war effort, it's going to have secondary and tertiary effects in their ability to execute their war effort. And you can see here, this is a huge area to cover. And the Japanese, again, don't have the industrial resources to fully project combat power for an extended period of time. During the war, the United States would produce almost 100 aircraft carriers. Smaller, not all Essex-class carriers, but some smaller escort carriers too. The Japanese will produce like 6, to give you an idea of how this power projection is very important. And for us, in the interwar years, the United States sees something coming with Japan. And the fact that we're going to have to cross the 6,000-mile pond and fight the Japanese where the Ryukyu island chain is, just south of Japan proper. And this is where the Marine Corps begins this idea of amphibious assault, looking for a job to validate our existence in the 1920s and 1930s. And this War Plan Orange that you see here has us crossing this large lake and fighting the Japanese in their own backyard. And again, this is what's going to underpin American strategy and a lot of American courses of action during the war itself. Now let's talk about the environment in the Pacific. And again, having lived there for 4 years, it's hot, it's wet, and it's humid. It's just like Louisiana in the summer. Okay. But it also consists of very dense jungle that has grown on top of these coral croppings that have come out of the sea due to geology over the years. This coral is very sharp. It is hard. You can't dig into it because it's literally rock hard. Steep ravines that are conducive to the defense. And so when the Marines or the Army soldiers go ashore, a lot of times you have these beaches that have all this flora and fauna that is easy to hide defensive positions, and the Marines and soldiers have to clear these things out, which makes the war even more difficult. On top of that, you're also fighting nature. In the Pacific, there's all kinds of vectors and diseases, malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, that decimate both the Japanese and the American forces. Most of your casualties on Guadalcanal have nothing to do with combat. They're more to do with the physical health of the Marines and soldiers that are on those islands themselves. Also, when you're in some of these streams and lakes in this area, they're infested with leeches. And if you try to pull the leech off, the leech will indeed vomit into the open sore, which will turn into a festering pustule, which will also pull you off the line. So my point here is, with our other graphic representation, is that this is a nasty place to fight a war. There's this misrepresentation that the Japanese are trained jungle fighters. No, they're not. They're no more trained to fight in the jungle than the Americans were. Japan is not a jungle island, not a tropical island. So the Japanese are having to learn how to fight in this environment too. The difference is the Americans have the medical and logistics capability to sustain these forces. The Japanese do not. The Pacific is unique from the European theater for another reason, not just from the geography that I talked about and the distances involved, but unlike in the European theater where you have a supreme Allied commander, you don't have that in the Pacific. You have Nimitz, Admiral Nimitz, who's in charge of the American fleet, and you have Douglas MacArthur. These two men are co-equals. They do not work under a supreme Allied commander like you have Eisenhower in the European theater. And in 1943, they both briefed their respective plans to President Roosevelt in Honolulu, and they're both talking about how their respective campaign, whether coming through the West Indies or through the island hopping campaign, is the way to go against the Japanese. And FDR, being the consummate politician when it comes to make a decision for these gentlemen, he says, yes, to both. So as a result, you're going to have two campaigns, both of them very naval-centric. The island hopping campaign, when you see it to the top, with Admiral Nimitz, going through the Gilbert Islands, the Marshalls, Guam, Tinian, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and the one with MacArthur starts off with Operation Cartwheel, going up through Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and up through Philippines, where he can indeed return after his ignominious departure in 1941. And so what you see here is a campaign that is naval-centric, meaning we're going to take all these tiny islands, move inland, and then move on to the next island. The largest land operation you're going to see going on is in the Philippines when MacArthur goes into Luzon. Other than that, most of it is a smaller island that we are taking, not a large subsequent operation ashore, as we would say in the Marine Corps. Think about Normandy. You land on the beaches, and you got to push all the way into Germany. Or when they land into North Africa, they land on the western shores, you have to push all the way into Tunisia. You don't have that here. It's largely smaller islands themselves, which require you, again, to have ships and naval surface fire support and air support all in a coordinated effort, flying from naval platforms. It makes the campaign significantly different. And you can see here the laundry list of operations that require significant naval support. Not to mention, the one on the very bottom tends to be glossed over in the history books. The United States Navy's submarine fleet does an amazing job of seeking about 90% of the Japanese merchant fleet by 1944. So all the supplies that they need to get out of the West Indies aren't even getting up to Japan anymore because the United States Navy has sunk most of the Japanese merchant fleet, and the Japanese can't replace it. And this naval-centric work is obviously, theme is reflected in many of his works, as you can see here with the sinking of the Wasp, the SBD pilot, tail gunner, Mr. Hilliard sitting there in his fighting stance, and the Marines going ashore at Tarawa. Cultural schisms are key here in the Pacific. We hate them, and they hate us. West meets East, and the two cultures really don't understand each other at all. There is a study done in the 1930s by a woman who publishes a book called The Chrysanthemum and the Sword by Ruth Benedict, and she tries to explain these differences. But the book is actually classified during the war. It seems it's determined to be sensitive information. It's published afterwards, and she basically says this is the most alien civilization we Americans have ever met, and we're not going to understand them anytime soon. From the Japanese perspective, they saw themselves as having the right to expand under Shido Mizuku, meaning they saw themselves as the leading race in the world, that they were the most virtuous people in existence, and they had to save humanity from becoming devils or from this descending moral virtue that they themselves owned. This is how they saw the world. The Americans were, and I'll use the quote, big-nosed, smelly barbarians is how they referred to us. And they saw themselves liberating East Asia from the Western imperialism that had been around for centuries. Of course, what they really wanted was Asia for they said Asian for the Asians. What they really meant was Asia for the Japanese. They saw themselves replacing the Chinese influence in that area of the world to make themselves the predominant nation-state peoples of East Asia. And so while they framed it under a co-prosperity sphere, it really was focused on Japan being the preeminent power in Asia now. And from the Japanese perspective, this is actually published in one of their magazines, so this is, as a historian, I'm merely quoting. Men make money to live luxuriously and overeducate their wives who are allowed to talk too much. Their lack of real culture is betrayed by the love of jazz. Americans are still untamed since the wild pioneer days. Holdups, assassinations, kidnapping gangs, bribery, corruption, and the lynching of Negroes are still practiced. Outwardly civilized, it is inwardly corrupt and decadent. Now, from the American perspectives, the Americans see the Japanese as being basically superficially arrogant. The Japanese are new to the world, the larger globe. If you think about what happens when Admiral Perry goes into Japan in the mid-19th century with the Great White Fleet, and he forces Japan to open up to the outside world and start becoming a trading partner. After the Meiji Restoration in 1869, she realizes that she does indeed need to be a modern industrial nation, and she builds a military that reflects it. She gets a lot of support from the British and the Germans, and they build militaries based upon those models. However, with this new modernization comes the arrogance that we were just talking about. They see other people outside of the Yamato race as something lesser, and of course, we will in turn see them as barbarous, depraved, inhumane, and uncivilized after we've seen the acts of the Japanese violence that occurs in Korea in 1910, in Manchuria in 1931, and of course in China in 1937. And much as they look down upon the Americans, we look down upon them as something subhuman, and you can see in the depictions there of how we viewed the Japanese. Again, so at this core, it's a race war in the Pacific, which makes it particularly nasty. One of the leading books out there, if this is an area you'd like to read about, is War Without Mercy by John Dower. It is a Pulitzer Prize-winning book, and he goes into great detail to explain the motivations on both sides of this war. And because of the reasons I just stated, the brutality is horrific. No quarter taken, none given by either side. And you can see here, few Japanese prisoners are actually captured because they all sacrificed themselves. And what most American intelligence officers don't realize is that the few Japanese that they do capture, many of them are not Japanese. They're Korean laborers who were put into slavery to dig all those defensive positions that the Japanese will put on these home islands. They're actually Korean laborers, not Japanese soldiers who have surrendered. And as the war is going south for the Japanese, they adopt a policy called ketsugo, which is basically to bleed the Americans to death, literally. If we can get enough Americans to die and stymie their offenses, maybe we could get some kind of negotiated peace, maybe. Problem with that is the American objective from the Casablanca Conference in 1943 is unconditional surrender. And when Harry Truman takes office in the spring of 1945, he says, and I quote, "I'm going to follow FDR's policies to the best of my ability," of which unconditional surrender will remain. Because of the Japanese situation and their allegiance to the emperor himself, they will start their kamikaze attacks. They start earlier than Okinawa, but that's when you really see them coming to fruition. Banzai attacks, where they come in full force into the American positions themselves. And for the Japanese soldier, what is right is what you are told to do. That's what is moral and just. And so when they are told to charge an American position that has plenty of machine gun rounds available to it, that's not an illegal order or an immoral order. That's what they were told to do, and that's the right thing to do. So there's a subsequent difference regarding how they see war progressing and how we see it. The Japanese will make excellent use of the caves and the natural defensive terrain of many of these islands. What they will do is they'll make a defensive position in a given cave or location, and they won't leave, even if we're trying to get them to surrender. So what we come up with is called the blowtorch and corkscrew method, where you throw in a satchel charge into the cave, have it go off, and then you bring in a flamethrower, and then you fill the cave with flame. Many times in these campaigns themselves, the Japanese will surround themselves with civilians in an attempt to thwart the Americans from actually getting the Japanese out. But again, this is a brutal contest, and many civilians are caught in the middle, specifically on the island of Okinawa, which has about 300,000 inhabitants. About 120,000 Okinawans are killed, 120,000 are maimed or wounded, and 100,000 basically walk away unscathed. It is a scar that still resonates with the Okinawan people. They were given back to the Japanese in 1971, and were not happy about it. But again, this idea of wholesale civilian deaths comes about due to the nature of this war, again, coming from a lot of these cultural schisms in the way we viewed each other. And here's what Ruth Benedict says about the average Japanese soldier. For the American fighting man, we'll flip the coin over here from the movie of The Purple Heart, which is about the Doolittle Raiders, the movie that they made in 1944. And he says, if you think killing us is going to put the fear of God into the United States of America and stop them from sending other flyers to bomb you, you're dead wrong. We'll blacken your skies, we'll burn your cities to the ground, and make you get down on your knees and beg for mercy. This is your war. You wanted it, you asked for it, and now you're going to get it. And it won't be finished until your dirty little empire is wiped off the face of the earth. So again, I'm painting the picture of the animosity and the animus that exists on both sides of the equation here in the Pacific War. And it's reflective in the military deaths themselves. You can see the Japanese are willing to sacrifice themselves en masse, where the Americans, we value life in a different manner than they do. The assault, the dropping of the atomic bomb, which is a decision that is often discussed. People like to argue, was Harry Truman told what the numbers were going to be if you invaded the home island? The answer for me as a historian is no. Nobody gave him a number, but he doesn't need a number. He knows it's going to be horrific regardless of how many Americans you put on that beach. Because in the spring of 1945, the Japanese Diet unanimously passed a motion to mobilize every man, woman, and child on the island of Honshu, Kyushu, and Hokkaido. On that note, I will conclude my remarks. I'm sorry it wasn't more uplifting for you, but history is not necessarily uplifting, but I like to be factual. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Up next, I'll ask the two ladies to come up as I introduce them. We have Nell Calloway, the president and CEO of the Chenault Aviation and Military Museum in Monroe, Louisiana, and she'll be joined by Dr. Steph Hennershitz. Nell has been the director and now president CEO of the museum since 2008. The granddaughter of General Claire Chennault, the founder of the famous Flying Tigers, Nell has a passion for the museum's mission that is both keenly professional and deeply personal. She leads the Chennault family's vision for the General's legacy through the museum and her constant work around the United States and the world. She has worked tirelessly, both nationally and internationally, to remind people of the close relationship between the United States and China and the people of China and Asia during World War II. Internationally, she has been an honored guest of the Chinese government on many occasions because the Flying Tigers are still the stuff of legend in China. It's one of the interesting things I've found in my time at the World War II Museum is that as much as our nations may disagree or our governments can't get along, there is a deep tie to the Chinese people and those who were there before Pearl Harbor to help and remained after Pearl Harbor throughout the war. She's a well-known advocate for veterans and their families across the United States and around the world, and she regularly meets with veterans and their families. And it's an honor for her to be able to preserve the rich history of Northeast Louisiana and share a little bit of that with us today. Nell, thank you for being here. With her is Dr. Steph Hennershitz. She is the senior historian at the National World War II Museum's Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. She joined us in June of 2021, received her PhD from Maryland in 2013, and she has specializes in World War II, particularly the home front. She's published on Japanese American incarceration, and most recently, her award-winning book, Japanese American Incarceration, The Camps and Coerced Labor During World War II. It won an award for taking a new look at this often discussed topic. And she, as well as John, is working on her next 2 books, I think, right now. So they're going to get into a conversation about this very famous individual who served in the same theater as Tom Lea and who met with Tom Lea. Steph, take it away.
Thank you, Jeremy, for that introduction, and thank you for everyone for being here today. I know it's not ideal conditions, but we are very excited to have all of you here, and I'm excited to be interviewing Nell. So I'm going to start with an image that you are probably very familiar with, especially after having taken the time to go through the exhibit. So that's the sketch up here, Tom Lea's sketch of Claire Chenault. And I wanted to pull out a little quote from the article, it was May 1944, that accompanied this article in Life magazine. "The final tragic side of an airman in wartime is the fight. Having mastered his plane in all weathers, he must learn to kill and fly home again. Killing in the air is an intricate skill, and there is no greater student of it than Claire Lee Chenault." And what I want to do is turn to Nell, because I think there's another side of Chenault that we don't really hear about too much, a side of him that really started before the war, before Pearl Harbor, and kind of before the Flying Tigers. And Nell, when we were discussing this a couple weeks ago, described her grandfather as a humanitarian. And I think that is a different side than what we're used to. So Nell, could you tell us a little bit about what you mean when you use the word humanitarian to describe your grandfather?
Yeah, and I want to thank the Hilliard Museum and the World War II Museum for having me today. I always enjoy being able to talk about my grandfather. But to do that, I'd like to give just a little bit of background. He actually got his wings in 1919, right after World War I, and he studied aviation. He even wrote a book on tactical pursuit. And he created an act, which you see right here. This was standing in front of a plane. It was called The 3 Men on the Flying Trapeze. And this was in the early 30s. And so what he did was try to figure out a better way, if we were to get into another war, that you could use airplanes, because he felt like World War I was pretty primitive. And so he used, and he said, far from being, they were called barnstormers, but far from being that, he used Immelman's loops, formation, and just different things to try to figure out a way to fight another war if we had that opportunity. Of course, World War I was to be the war to end all wars, and as we know, it wasn't. So, but about that time, bombers had come along, and they kept telling Chenault, you really need to go with the bomber theory. The bombers can do it all. They can fly faster, further. We put guns on the side, top, front, bottom, and they can do it all. And fighter planes are pretty much obsolete. We're not going to need those anymore. Well, as I tell people, my grandfather didn't always listen very well, and he continued to teach his fighter tactics. So in 1937, they told him, you'll never rise above the rank of captain. You're all washed up. You can't hear because you've been flying those open-air airplanes for so long, and it's really time that you return to the cotton fields back home. So instead of doing that, China had heard about his book on tactical pursuit and how he used fighter tactics. So they actually invited him to come over and do a survey of the Chinese Air Force. He arrived in China June 1st, 1937. And in the middle of June, he did this survey. And he actually was only hired for 3 months. So Chiang Kai-shek thought he had 500 airplanes. After the survey, Chenault said, "You have 500 airplanes, but you only have 91 that fly." That is how far behind they were in aviation. But during this journey, he also saw firsthand what the Japanese were doing to the Chinese people. Steph, most people have never heard that between 1931, when they first invaded Manchuria, and 1945, the Japanese killed between 20 and 50 million Chinese people. That is a number it's known as the Forgotten Theater. So people have never heard that. We knew what was going on in Europe, but we did not know what was going on in China, nor did, unfortunately, we care very much. So he saw the Chinese, and he actually, I think he developed a real respect for them. He saw their tenacity, he saw their resilience, and he realized that they were really a people in need. So in July, when the actual war between China and Japan started, he offered his services to Chiang Kai-shek wherever he could use them, and they were gladly accepted. So in the summer of 1937, he is put in charge as the air advisor to the Chinese Air Force.
Excellent. There was something you mentioned, too, when we were talking, I think it was like 2 weeks ago or so, and I think it really brings to light this combination between the respect for the Chinese people and wanting to help, and also his brilliant sort of innovations when it comes to flight. You had mentioned an early warning system that he had helped to develop and how that brings these two sides together. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, in 1925, he was actually stationed in Hawaii, and he had his first squadron command, the 19th, in Hawaii. And actually, that was when they did the Oriental Exclusion Act, which made the Japanese very angry at that time. And believe it or not, he felt like the Hawaiian Islands were susceptible to attack in the 1920s. So he started trying to figure out a way they could protect themselves. And he stationed men on a water tower, and he flew patrols, armed patrols around the Hawaiian Islands. Well, after a while, they told him he was wasting too much gas and too much whatever. But that was when he realized that if a fighter airplane was going to have an opportunity, he would have to know in advance. So when he gets to China, they have 91 airplanes that are operational, and he knew that the only way that they would be able to even fight was if they had the opportunity to get into the air before they started dropping the bombs. So he created an early warning system all over southern China. They used telephones, they used telegraph. They actually, in the village, had a 3-ball system. When 1 ball went up, that meant the Japanese were 1 hour out. When 2 balls went up, that meant they were 30 minutes out. That 3rd ball meant they were under imminent attack. And that gave the planes the opportunity to get up there and do interception, but also it saved millions of Chinese lives. It was the very first chance that the Chinese had ever had a chance to run for cover before the Japanese started dropping the bombs.
Right, and I do have a picture up behind us. You've already mentioned the more tactical, I guess, strategic relationship with Chiang Kai-shek, but want to call attention to the other figure. So Madam Chiang what kind of relationship did your grandfather have with her?
He respected her and said, in fact, I think he quoted, she's one of the most brilliant and accomplished women that he had ever known. She was actually educated in the United States. So, and believe it or not, in China, in the 1930s, she was at the head of the Chinese Air Force. And she is actually the one that hired him. When he first got to China, this woman came in and she spoke English, and he thought it was maybe a servant. And then they came in and said, "This is Madame Chiang Kai-shek," so he quickly hopped up. But she was. They had a very, very good relationship during the whole war.
And how did that relationship shape what you had mentioned and I had mentioned before about his humanitarian side? So we know how he approached that based on what you said through air and through tactics with that. But a little bit more going back about what you brought up, his relationship with the Chinese people. Did he have a relationship with Madam that touched on those different aspects, that touched on what was going on with the people in general?
You know, my grandfather loved children. He had 8 of them with my grandmother, so obviously he loved children. But when he got to China, he realized how many of the Chinese children were orphans. And they called them warphans, not orphans. And the whole time he was there, he supported these Chinese orphans. I have a letter that Madame Chiang Kai-shek wrote to him in June of 1940, before we entered the war. And she is thanking him for sending $600 for the orphans. Now, $600 in 1940 was a lot of money, and he had a family back home. But that is how much compassion he had for these Chinese children that had lost both of their parents.
Were there other things that he did as well? So, and when I say apart, certainly not downplaying that much money, because it was a lot of money. Were there other things that he perhaps worked with Madam with to help these orphans, to help basically Chinese children or the Chinese people?
Well, he supported 48 orphans the whole time during the war.
Right.
But you know, he had a very, very good respect and relationship with the Chinese people, because during this time, he relied on the Chinese people to set up this early warning system, but he also relied and was able to recruit hundreds of thousands of Chinese who would actually day and night break the rocks to fill in the holes of the craters that the Japanese bombs had left. And that was very crucial, and he established runways in strategic areas and actually really laid the foundation of the war that we would end up fighting when the United States arrived in China.
Right, right. And just so you know, I did crop out, Nell was kind enough to share the letter with me, and I cropped out the wrong, the wrong part of it. So we had wanted to put up her, Madam's thankfulness for the money that he had donated, but we did talk a little bit about the thing that I did manage to crop out. So could you talk a little bit about what I mistakenly put up on the screen?
I think it's so interesting. If you have a chance to read that, in this letter at the beginning, she thanks him for the $600 that he had sent to the orphans, but then she talks about that Chongqing had been bombed that morning and several people had been killed, but at 3 o'clock, thousands of Chinese turned out for the dragon boat races. So and that's another thing that kind of shows the resilience of the Chinese people, that even though their city had been bombed early that morning, they actually turned out to have a little fun.
Yeah, and I think that was something based on talking to you and reading about Chenault that he really appreciated, that resiliency, and really made him determined to continue to help the people. Speaking of letters, so we had discussed a letter that I think he had written to your mother.
My mother, yeah.
It was, and you had described it as this sort of life-changing journey that he took, or a life-changing part of his life in China. Could you remind me, because I remember it being an important point, but also tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, this letter is in June of 1937. And my mother was only 9 years old when he left for China. And so this was in June of 1937. He's writing to a 9-year-old, but he starts telling her about a 4,500-mile journey that he's going to go on. And this is when he did the survey of the Chinese Air Force. But I think it's very significant because that was life-changing for him. It was so life-changing for him that actually between 1937 and 1941, when the United States entered the war, that there were 2, possibly 3 occasions that the United States told him, if you don't come home right now, your citizenship is going to be revoked. And he ignored that because he saw these people in need, and he realized that he had the ability, with his studies and everything else that he did, he had the ability to help these people. So in spite of this threat, he stayed in China, and I think that's pretty significant.
Oh, yeah, and I did not know about the citizenship issue at all. So when I heard that from Nell, I was kind of blown away by that. As the director of the museum that you work at, I'm sure, obviously, being a family member, you have quite a few letters that your grandfather had written home. What are some of the other themes that tend to come out in these letters when he's writing back to his family? What kind of challenges or obstacles that is he kind of personally discussing?
You know, in 1938, I have a letter that he wrote home, and talking about what you just talked about, John, is he said then, if the American people just knew what they were doing by sending iron and ore and all the materials to the Japanese people. And if they could just see what these materials were doing and killing so many Chinese people, he felt like that would, change things. But unfortunately, it took him a lot longer to be able to figure that out.
Right. And then kind of jumping ahead just a little bit, tell us about post-war. So what were some of the things that kind of stuck with him from his experience in China? What were some of the kind of legacies of that?
He came home, of course, in 1945, and he felt like that communism was going to be the next big threat to the United States. So he decided he would go back and he would create a civilian airline, the very first civilian airline, and it was called the Civil Air Transport. But it was interesting because these airplanes not only were used to transport supplies and people, supplies because the Japanese had depleted China of all of its goods, agriculture, livestock, anything they had. So he would use these airplanes. They said the front half of the airplane was filled with people. The back half of the airplane was filled with animals and agriculture products. In fact, the animals urinated on the floor so much it put holes in the floor of the planes. But it was also used as a covert airline to try to supply the nationalists who were out there trying to defeat the communists, Mao Zedong and the communists. So eventually, we all know how that turned out, but eventually, when the war was over, he ended up selling the Civil Air Transport to the CIA, and it became Air America.
Excellent. Yeah, it's really fascinating. Again, things I did not know about. So this is why you're here, to kind of tell us these sides that we might not understand about your grandfather. Which brings me to the museum. So can you talk a little bit about what sort of is the mission of the museum? What are some things that visitors, when they go there, could learn about that perhaps take us beyond that image that we have from the Tom Lea portrait?
Well, as I said in my introduction, my heart is for the veterans and soldiers. So our museum, we have all wars from World War I through Iraqi freedom. We have over 11,000 artifacts on display, but one of the things I'm proudest of is that we have veteran programs and initiatives. We do PTSD clinics. We have our own chapter, the Disabled American Veterans Association, that has been able to get over $2 million worth of additional benefits for our local veterans annually. We're involved in the Library of Congress, their Veterans Oral History Project. So we're really proud of some of the veterans programs, and the main thing is the education programs, because I think everybody in this room knows that if we don't inspire our young people to want to continue to serve in our military, our country's not going to stay free. And I tell all of them, because I have been to China on several occasions, I've never met a man, woman, or child, and I don't care how high-ranking they are, that wouldn't do anything to trade places with all of us and to have the freedoms that we all enjoy. And it's only because of our soldiers and the defense that they put up, and even today, the ones right now that are training this very moment to protect our country if we get attacked again. So we owe them a lot. We owe them a lot.
Right, right. Something else that I want to talk about, because I think it is very important, and we had talked about this at dinner a little bit last night. What does your grandfather's relationship with China, might it be able to tell us about today? What kind of themes or legacies might still be present today based on that relationship?
Well, what I do when I travel to Taiwan or China, I get asked questions about, of course, the politics today right now is very difficult between China and the United States. But as a reporter asked me one day, I'm in Washington, I was fixing to go to Taiwan. They said, how can you justify going to Taiwan, after you've been to China so many times? And I told them, I have no problem. I have no justifying what I'm doing. It's because what everybody in this room needs to remember is that my grandfather got to China in 1937. The Japanese were bombing the KMT, and the Japanese were bombing the communists, and eventually the Japanese bombed us. And so what I really want everybody to remember is that what we did by putting aside our differences, because China obviously was not our friend before the war, but we put aside our differences and we were able to defeat the Japanese military. But my grandfather made a statement, the last sentence of his book, it says, "It is my fondest hope that the sign of the flying tiger will remain aloft just as long as it is needed on both shores of the Pacific to show two great peoples working toward a common goal. And I think if we can remember that and we can build our relationship on that, then maybe we can come to a better understanding now.
Yeah, absolutely. And then apart from that, you've certainly given us a lot of things to think about with your grandfather. You have the legacy of his relationship with China, talked about the humanitarian side. Is there anything else that perhaps we don't know that should be part of your grandfather's legacy? So what other things might you want us to take away from this symposium, keeping in mind?
I think the only thing that I can think of right now is my grandfather led as one of them, never over them. You know, the AVG never had a rank, and he allowed the AVG to basically rule itself. I mean, they had their own people that they picked that would actually, if somebody had a problem, it wasn't just him that settled the differences. And so he really and truly was one of them instead of being over them. And I think that's very, very important, because one of the things I've admired about him so much, when you've talked to anybody, especially when some of the AVG Flying Tigers were still alive, is the respect that they had for him. But it wasn't just a respect for a commander and his ideas. He was a true friend too, and I think that's important.
Yeah, excellent. So I'm going to actually wrap things up here, and thank you, Nell, for telling us more about your grandfather, and I will turn it over to Jeremy. I think we're going to have some Q&A.
Thank you, ladies.
Okay.
We have a microphone for a quick question and answer period for both John and for Steph and Nell. And I'm going to take MC's prerogative and ask Nell, when he was on the cover of Life magazine with that portrait by Lee, was that the equivalent of being on the Wheaties box after you win the Super Bowl? What was his reaction to that? Well, he was a celebrity, but did he have any note on that?
No, he really didn't. But yeah, you know, that was another thing about him, is that he kind of ran from publicity. He really cared nothing about being, you know, having the publicity. That didn't really mean anything to him. So he was actually on the cover of many magazines, Time and Life, and some other, the Saturday Evening Post, some of the other magazines that were popular at that time. But if you would ask anybody, I think when the reporters showed up, he kind of ran the other way a little bit.
And for questions, Ben will bring the microphone to you. Don't be shy.
Thank you so much. I'm an Air Force brat. I want to give congratulations to your mother for being a single woman so much of the time, raising 8 children. Being a military wife is a struggle. It's difficult. It's challenging. But my mother did it gracefully, and it sounds like your mother did too.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. Yeah, you know, when he was started getting publicity before the war started, he actually, in 1938, they had a bounty on his head, $25,000, the Japanese said, for anybody that could shoot him down, because he was flying this Hawk Special all over China, and there's many speculations about how many Japanese airplanes he actually did combat with. And my grandmother, it was my grandmother, but thank you, because I was very close to her. Her name was Nell, named after her. But she actually feared for her life. And she lived, you know, he settled them on a little farm in a rural part of Louisiana. And she actually feared for her life, that there would be some kind of reprisal against the family.
No questions? All the way in the end there, Ben.
What would you think your grandfather's greatest accomplishment was, what he thought his greatest accomplishment was?
I think he thought his greatest accomplishment were the tactics. My mother and I were at Nellis Air Force Base a few years ago, and the head of Nellis Air Force Base told us then, he said, you know, what your grandfather, he was talking to my mother, what your father did in air tactics, he said, we still use today. He said, you can't reinvent the Immelmans, the loops, the formation flying, all those things. He said, we just adapt them to modern day airplanes. And he was just so focused on how you could use the airplane to do better combat against the enemy. I feel like he would think that would be his greatest accomplishment.
My father was on was in the Navy, and he was on a minesweeper. He rarely, if ever, spoke about it. And I heard that you say the Navy obviously had a huge influence over the war. Can you speak a bit about what the minesweepers did during the war?
Yeah. The biggest problem you had.
Hey, John,
as a
could
retired
you lean
Marine-
into the microphone, please?
Isn't that
Thank
on?
you. Yes, sir.
Just get close.
It's good.
There we go. As a retired Marine Corps officer, paid political advertisement there, the biggest problem with the amphibious assault is mines. Why? Because they're cheap and easy to throw out there, and nothing will confound an amphibious assault like mines sitting in the offshore of a littoral area. Because as the landing craft go ashore in the subsequent waves, what it does, not only does it destroy the landing craft themselves, but what it does is it disrupts the flow of the ship-to-shore movement. For our Army brethren, it's just like doing an airborne operation. Every man has a seat on a boat or on an airplane, and they come in on a scheduled wave at a set time, at a set place. And just like in Tetris, if you play the computer game, if one thing gets messed up, it throws everything else off. And so to that extent, the minesweepers are an imperative part of an amphibious assault to get those mines out of the way so you can do the ship-to-shore movement. And there was a lot of problems, especially in the European theater with that. The Germans were very adept, specifically at the landings at Salerno. And so these minesweepers are low-tech. It's not very glamorous work. It's kind of the littoral Navy, for those of you who are not familiar with the naval service, is kind of like the red-headed stepchild of the Navy. You know, everybody wants to be an aviator or a battleship or a submarine guy, but if you're on the Gators, as we refer to them, the littoral warfare, they do a lot of the dirty work that get the Marines ashore, and they don't get the recognition they do. Marines love them, of course, but that's the importance of that work, because I can't get ashore unless a minesweeper has cleared that field of those mines. Does that answer your question, ma'am? Well, welcome.
Then Paul has a question in the front row, please.
Nell, would you expand a little bit on the AVG guys that flew for the AVG? Okay. The Tigers? Okay.
I'd be glad to. So at the end of, actually the very end of 1940, beginning of 1941, obviously China was still very behind it in the aviation department. For a while, the Russians were supplying them with airplanes and aviators, and then, of course, Russia got busy over with the Germans, and they had to pull out. So some of the Chinese businessmen came to the United States to try to buy airplanes for China. Fortunately, we'd signed the Lend-Lease Act by then, and that would allow China to buy airplanes. Well, they had a difficult time, but the British had this airplane, this P-40, that absolutely, was kind of going out of style. They had a new model coming in, and they had already ordered 100. So President Roosevelt sold those 100 airplanes to China in the Lend-Lease Act, and he also allowed Chenault and to be able to go to the military bases and recruit men to come fight for China. They recruited 100 pilots and about 200 support crew, and they started landing in China in the summer of 1941. They didn't actually see any action until December 20th of 1941, a little less than 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, but they shot down 9 of 10 Japanese bombers. And, America had been an isolationist country. We didn't know if we could fight a battle, much less win one. So what this did to the morale of the country, who we had just waked up and realized that we were at war on two different fronts. So what that did to the morale of the country is really immeasurable, but also what it did for the Chinese to know that the Americans were coming to the rescue after all these long years of fighting against the Japanese, can't be measured either. So it is really amazing. And these men flew for China. They signed a 1-year contract to fly for China. And so from their victory on December 20th of 1941 until they were incorporated back into the United States military on July 4th of 1942, they are credited with shooting down 299 Japanese airplanes confirmed, about that many unconfirmed, and they only lost 12 of their own in actual combat. They never lost a battle in the sky, and actually at times they went up 20-1 odds. So it was really an incredible story what these men were able to do. The pilots got $600 a month, which that was a huge increase from what the military was giving them when they resigned. And the support crew usually got about $300, but they were also told that they would be given $500 for every Japanese airplane they shot down. So that was pretty good incentive for these young guys to want to go over there and because all these young aviators felt like they were invincible, right? Yeah, they did.
To include that, in that initial batch was a derelict Marine Corps officer named Pappy Boyington.
Yeah, it was. Well, it was, but actually Pappy Boyington didn't like to obey rules very much. Right. But I won't go into any more detail than that. When y'all saw Baba Black Sheep, I think he had changed a little bit from his AVG days. So
that's right. Absolutely.
I actually have a question for John, if I can jump in. So you gave us an excellent contextual overview of the war that Tom Lea covered. So I'm thinking about Nell's grandfather and Chenault. If you could give some context to the air war, because I know that's your jam. So how does Chenault fit into that, or what can Chenault tell us about that context? Of
and she brings up, she made it, if I may, in your comments, it's really a forgotten theater, the China-Burma-India theater. It's kind of the third chapter. People talk about the European theater, Pacific War, and then there's this thing called the CBI. And I love the fact that you brought up people that realize the mass of humanity that is involved in a China-Burma-India theater and how important it is, because they basically drain the Japanese of logistical resources. By the time the Japanese are already fighting the Americans, they're already rationing matches and soap and the basic sinews of war because they're involved in a land war in Asia, to quote, the Princess Bride, And so as a result, what the air war over China is important because not only do they help stymie the Japanese offensive, but it also opens the door for the 20th Bomber Command that comes in the spring of 1944 with the B-29s. And that starts the strategic bombing of Japan out of China, and those runways that you talked about that were built for, the American volunteer group and the Flying Tigers end up becoming runways that Curtis LeMay, when he shows up with 20th Bomber Command, start using for the strategic bombing of Japanese targets in the southern part of Japan. So it's actually kind of a gateway for the American aerial offensive over the home islands. Now, eventually the B-29s are moved to the Marianas because then they have a direct route to Japan proper, but it begins there in the China-Burma-India theater.
Questions. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I was in the U.S. Air Force, so we were at Misawa Air Force Base in Japan in the early 60s, 1960s. What would Chenault have thought about the use of the atomic bomb?
Well, I think he would think it was very necessary because we all know that once that atomic bomb was dropped, it actually saved maybe thousands, maybe a million Americans who were planning to, for the Japanese invasion. So I think kind of goes back to the book I read about Paul Tibbets. When they asked him if he had any regrets, he didn't, because he knew that even though it killed so many of the Japanese people, it also saved so many lives. and I think he would go along with that.
What would you say about post-war Japan and the problems? I just recently interviewed a 97-year-old surgeon here in Lafayette who was in Tokyo and did his service there. It was a difficult time. Mm-hmm. Can you speak to that?
Dr. Me?
Yes.
Yeah. This is I'm glad you brought that up, actually. Here's another shameless political plug. The museum is opening up a new pavilion called the Liberation Pavilion, which addresses the immediate post-war era. What did it all mean? What happened? What occurred? And the current narration is the war is over, everybody goes home. But in Germany and Japan, these countries are now prostrate. Their infrastructure's gone. There's no economy. Most of the men are dead. And of course, in Japan, many of the civilians are dead with the firebombing. And so it is a horrific time to live in any of the occupied periods. And a lot of people have been displaced. Either the Japanese move them out or the Germans move them out, and people want to go home. And so it is a time of incredible turmoil in Asia and in Germany at this time. And so one of the, I'll say, the good news stories that comes about, because it's such a horrible place to be, is the Marshall Plan in 1947, where the United States decides to deliberately help our former enemies, something new and unusual in world history, to rebuild these economies and rebuild this infrastructure. And, oh, by the way, help stymie communism by creating free market economies in our former enemies' nations themselves. And so what you see here is a development of the global system that we live in today largely comes from what you saw in that immediate post-war era because of what the United States did to engage the larger global community, given what Germany and Japan looked like in 1946 and 1947. They were horrific places. Matter of fact, I don't know, they have numbers on top of my head, but the numbers of starvation go into the millions. I don't know what they are top of my head, but they're huge.
Yeah, and one of our friends, Rich Frank, is writing a trilogy on the Pacific War. The second one's soon, not soon enough for my liking, but he goes into the end of the war and how, as John was pointing out, the shipping lanes, it was our intention to starve the island. And then almost on a dime, we pivot so that when the winter of 45, 46 is coming in, what Nell mentioned was just about the American casualties with an invasion, killed and wounded. There would have been millions of Japanese that would have been killed had the war continued for another year. The last question's with Ben to your left panelist, and it's going to be James. If we can get the mic hot, please.
Miss Nell, your grandfather's parents, can you talk about them a little bit and his childhood that led him on the path to get to what he became?
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting story. Anyway, his parents were living in Rayville, Louisiana, and a carpetbagger had visited their house and actually tried to sell my great-grandfather some Mustang horses at an exorbitant price. Well, my great-grandfather wasn't going to buy them, and the carpetbagger wasn't going to leave, so he actually shot him through his hat. And the sheriff came and he asked my great-grandfather, John, he said, why did you try to kill him? He said, oh, no, I didn't try to kill him because he'd be dead if I did. But anyway, they thought maybe it was very expedient that he took a job outside of the state. So therefore, my grandfather happens to have been born in Commerce, Texas. He only lived there 6 weeks until they came back to Louisiana, to Gilbert, Louisiana, where his mother's parents were living. But in Commerce, they have a big plaque saying the birthplace of General Chenault. And about 5 years ago, the Chinese actually dedicated a plaque right beside it that is in Chinese as well. And we're working with a group right now of Chinese who feel like they need to put a statue of General Chenault in Commerce, Texas, where he was born. So, but he actually was raised in Louisiana. But yeah, thank you for asking that.
Great. Well, this concludes the first portion of our morning. So a round of applause for Dr. John Curatola, Dr. Steph Hennershitz, and Ms. Nell Calloway. We'll take about a 10-minute break. Try to make your way back here for half past the hour. So we're going to be at about 10:30. We'll start back up. Let us know if you have any questions. more personal into Tom Lea, the person, Tom Lea, the artist. And we've got some great folks to have this conversation with us. They'll be led and chaired by our friend, Jamey Clement, who is our friend here at the Hilliard Art Museum, but also at the National World War II Museum. Jamey is the founder and chairman of the Land Board and Agricultural Consulting business. It's focused primarily on generating incremental income for family farms and ranches in order to preserve their legacy. He served as chairman of the board of King Ranch, Inc. from 2000 to 2021, where he also served as vice president and treasurer. Jamey is the founding chairman of the Management Council of the King Ranch Institute for Ranch Management at Texas A&M University in Kingsville before he stepped down in 2021 as well. I think he might have retired in 2021. Jamey's traveled the world with our museum, and I've had the pleasure of getting to know him and his family, including his son James, who served on the National World War II Museum's Board of Trustees. He's going to have this conversation with two of his friends, starting with Adair Margo. She chaired the President's Committee of Arts and Humanities during the two-term presidency of George W. Bush from 2000 to 2008. She joined First Lady Laura Bush in Paris for the United States re-entry into UNESCO, which I actually dug into, and it was back in 1984 with Reagan when we were pulled out of that. And she was appointed by Secretary of State Colin Powell to the U.S. National Commission for UNESCO. For all of this work and many other things, she received the U.S. Presidential Citizens Medal in 2007 from President Bush. She owned Adair Margo Gallery in El Paso, exhibiting over 400 artists from 12 countries, and she became especially devoted to Tom Lea. Founding the Tom Lea Institute in 2009, and then establishing the Tom Lea Trail, which connects the histories of 19 communities in Texas, New Mexico, and Chihuahua through Tom Lea's work. With Adair and Jamey will be Mac Greeley. Mac spent 21 years on active duty as a USMC aviator. He flew A4Es on close air support missions and served as an air liaison officer with the 2nd Battalion of the 26th Marines during 2 tours in Vietnam between 1965 and 1969. He commanded Marine Attack Squadron 223 before retiring in 1982. Later, he wrote for Aviation Week and Space Technology and was the editor at the U.S. Naval Institute, which I actually sent an email this morning to requesting a couple new books, Mac. Hopefully you can pull some strings. In 2008, he edited the 2,000-Yard Stare book on Tom Lea's artwork for Texas A&M University Press. Ladies and gentlemen, Jamey Clement, Adair Margo, and Mac Greeley.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thanks, Luann, for asking, and particular thanks to Paul for insisting we be here. As Jeremy said, I'm a 5th generation King Ranch family member, and through that time knew of Tom early on because of his 2-volume set, The King Ranch. But it wasn't until 95, 96, Adair toured with Tom to some of his work from World War II, which I was able to acquire a few pieces, but then got to know Tom, visited in El Paso, took my boys out there to meet him, and so that's the journey that started, and just getting to know Tom as a man was a special thing, and then I've just been totally immersed in his work and the history. So my job today is pretty easy because you have the 2 pros, Adair in his personal life, and certainly Mac in terms of his World War II work. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll turn it over to Adair to introduce herself, and we'll get started.
I'm a 3rd generation El Pasoan. My great-grandfather actually baptized Tom Lea when he was 8 years old in the Baptist church. He went to high school with my grandmother, but I did have an art gallery for 25 years, as was said earlier, showing 400 artists from 12 countries. But Tom Lea, there is something so exceptional about him, not only as an artist, but as a human being, that I knew his legacy was something I needed to preserve. And so that's why I started the Tom Lea Institute. And it connects you, you know, when you have a person of such goodwill and such a reverence for life as Tom Lea had, it's kind of like these natural connections to people like Jamey and Mac and, you know, all of you that just come about. It's been very enriching for me to be involved with his life.
Well, although I'm very proud to be a U.S. Marine, my background is really Army. My folks have been in the Army back to 1865, and I graduated from West Point in 1961 and ended up in the Marine Corps. All because a friend of mine said, hey, Pensacola's great, my cousin's flying down there, let's go do that. And then that son of a gun went, he went in the infantry and I went in the Marine Corps. And he didn't lie to me too much about it. It all turned out to be fine. But I was a boy in San Antonio, and I was entranced by a book called The Longhorns by J. Frank Dobie. And I'm sitting in my cousin's den in San Antonio, and there's a steer. Tom Lea was the illustrator, and there's a steer there branded murder. Some of you may know that story, not because the steer killed anybody, but because ownership of the steer, who owned this maverick, which was how things started out, precipitated a murder. So I thought, this is pretty cool. Anybody who does that, I mean, I was probably 10 years old when I saw this. So that was and I didn't, who's this guy that illustrated it? I probably didn't even realize it. But later on, I became familiar with life's picture history of World War II, and there's Tom Lea in it. And one thing and another, and after I retired from the Marine Corps, I got into the writing business. And one thing and another, I just picked up the phone one time at Naval History magazine at the Naval Institute when I was working there, and I called Tom on the phone, called him cold. And he said, come on down. I mean, he's a wonderful person. And he said, sure, come on down, I'll talk to you. So I go down to El Paso. Adair is there, and she introduces me. Sarah, Tom's wife, is there with them. And we go back to his studio, and Tom and I sit down, and we write, we have a wonderful interview. And I wrote an article about him for Naval History magazine. And it was reasonably well received. And the years go by, and one thing and another, and I get a call. Jim Lea, Tom's son, has all these diaries, the hitchhiker on the back road of war, and one thing and another. And Adair says, why don't you come down to Texas A&M and let's talk about this stuff. So I go down to the conference room, which is named for Tom Lea, and there in Texas, at Texas A&M with the Aggies and Charles Backus. And so they've got all this stuff laid out on the table, and they said, well, Jim says, I think there's a book here. And they all say, well, maybe there's something there, and they kind of look around the table, and who's going to put it together? And so the finger ended up pointed at me, and that's how I really got involved. I knew Tom only late in his life when I interviewed him for Naval History magazine, and so, but after that we corresponded. I tried not to intrude on his time, but I sent him books I thought he might like, some things from his days in Santa Fe with the Cinco Pintores and stuff like that. I just found him muy simpático. He was just wonderful, but I knew him for only a short period of time, and then the research started for the book.
And just so I don't forget it later, you're seeing murder and seeing those illustrations. See, that's what Dan Longwell saw. He read The Longhorns too, and he was the managing editor of really created Life magazine. And so it was through Tom Lea's, he'd read, seen murder, who does this? And then when they were starting to do some work covering the war, they went to Tom Lea in El Paso to do something on the cavalry. There's Longwell, yeah.
And I might mention one thing. Longwell was his great champion at Life magazine. He was from Neosho, Missouri, which was the West kind of in those days when he was born. And I don't know if if Tom really had any, he wasn't impressed, shall I say, with Henry Luce and Claire Booth Luce. Dan Longwell was the guy that he dealt with. And as far as he was concerned, Dan Longwell was Life magazine. And one of the key things that Dan wanted, he said, let's not get into semantics. Pictures and art are the same thing. As long as you have some appreciation, the editor has some appreciation for what he's looking at, doesn't make any difference if it was photographed or painted. So Dan Longwell is a driving force behind Art with a capital A in Life magazine, and one of his principles was, when we run a series of art, we should always have a picture of the artist at his easel in his studio with a painting. And that's why it's there, because of Dan Longwell.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, before I leap into my scripted questions, I remind you all that today's the last day of the actual paintings being on exhibit in the Hilliard Museum. So I encourage you to stop by there on the way out. Okay, Adair, I think what they we do. So we're going to talk a little bit about Tom's early life. Again, Adair, very familiar with that, and we'll turn it over. I guess we'll run this video.
Art and literature. His work rises to a level many have pursued, but few have achieved. His achievements are stunning when viewed in their separate parts. Each product of fermenting mind endowed with a phenomenal range of near perfection in execution. Adair Margo, founder of the Tom Lea Institute, tells his story.
It's a pleasure for me to share Tom Lea's story with you today. He was born on July 11, 1907 at 4:44 in the morning.
A native of El Paso, Texas, his high school art teacher was very influential.
Recognizing Tom's talent, she suggested the Art Institute of Chicago. His first year at the Art Institute, Tom spotted a beautiful girl named Nancy Jane Taylor, and they married in 1927. Tom made enough money to take Nancy to Europe. There, he said, he found the pictures he'd been looking for his whole life.
Sadly, Nancy died of appendicitis in 1936.
It was a terrible time for Tom Lea, but work kept him alive, especially mural commissions being offered by the Treasury Department Section of Fine Arts under Roosevelt's New Deal. His last mural painting, done in 1957, as a gift for the El Paso Public Library. Another person who came into Tom Lea's life was Sarah Dighton. When Tom looked at her over the dining table of their mutual friends, he knew Sarah was the one for him. The U.S. was gearing up for war. Tom became the first, accredited as a life artist correspondent, traveling over 100,000 miles over 4 years. Said he knew he couldn't say all he wanted to say about mankind's dying and living as a painter only. He taught himself to write, first writing a novel called The Brave Bulls, which was turned into a Hollywood movie. He also wrote A Wonderful Country, turned into a film starring Robert Mitchum. Other books followed.
Tom did not pander to the art world, but instead chose to paint in the style his subject demanded. he created masterpieces in virtually every medium and style: oil, pastel, watercolor, and ink. His paintings hung in the White House of both President George W. Bush and Lyndon Johnson, and his The Price hung outside the offices of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon to remind them of the cost of war. After a lifetime of illuminating the culture and history of the Southwest, Tom Lea died in 2001.
Adair, it went by a little quickly, but on their tombstone there's a great quote by Tom relating to his life in the Southwest. And so the question is, what was it about the Pass of the North that was important to his development as an artist? And then I think lead with that quote.
Right. I will lead with that quote. It's a quote that was made famous, actually more famous. I mean, Tom Lea lived in El Paso. He drew his nourishment from a place. So when I've served President Bush, I mean, I found people who knew him for sure. You know, the Librarian of Congress said that he knew his literature. David McCullough said, Tom Lea, you knew Tom Lea. He introduced me to the romance of the West. Marine commandants certainly knew his work in the Marines. But as far as a single world, the art world, he never fit into. He remained a classicist, and you asked about the Pass of the North. This is our mural in El Paso that ties back, I mean, to really, if you go to, this is a drawing. We were talking a little bit about the process that he followed. He was so thorough, but he really at heart was a muralist, like a frescante. He really was a fresco painter. And like those Italian Renaissance masters would do cartoons. If you all know the way you do a mural, you first will do a drawing. He would do these very elaborate, detailed drawings. And then you, on just brown paper, like throwaway paper, UT Austin has some of them, they become very brittle. But he would do very detailed drawings, and then you trace it onto the wall. The Renaissance masters would have drawings and then have holes around the outline, and then dust it with charcoal to transfer it onto the wall. So this is a preliminary drawing that he did for the Pass of the North. It's like the Parthenon. I mean, go to the next one. You saw it in the video. When Dana Gioia, the chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, saw this mural, he said, it is the finest of the period. Most artists during the New Deal were easel painters, but Tom Lea was trained as a muralist. He apprenticed to a muralist, John Warner Norton, in Chicago. When Chicago was being built in the 1930s, all these beautiful Holabird and Root buildings, he did murals with John Norton and got accustomed to doing, as buildings were going up, they'd be working on a mural on canvas in a huge studio. And then when the building was finished, they would glue it to the wall like wallpaper, not directly on the wall. And that's how all of his murals were done. This one, though, I think expresses so well, it's classicism. And he was a classicist sometimes. He wasn't a classicist. I mean, at heart, he was always a classicist. Timeless art that never grows old, not caught up in sweeps of styles and fashions that the art world talks about and publishes about. Tom Lea says, I don't think anybody's ever paid attention to me because they don't think I have a style. And that's what everybody taught. That's like Fashion Week, right? But when it comes down to it, he lasts. And you see it here. I think you see the nobility in all of his figures. This is our region where I live in El Paso, where we're 3 states and 2 countries meet. There's not one mode of living and one language. And he communicates that, but everything with great dignity. He was interested in the nobility of mankind, not his pettiness. And even in the war, I think the paintings that you saw, it's not just the gore. There's something heroic in that man. I used to cry even talking about the price. And he described that really in words too. But you see it in this painting, which is in our federal courthouse. This was done, Tom Lea was very tied to his region. So he'd been off in Chicago. He and Nancy moved to Santa Fe afterwards. He'd spent up time in Santa Fe as a child. But after she died in 1936, this was the first, I said in the video, that it was work that kept him alive. And at the time, it was this mural. It was a 7-state competition. People in El Paso were very concerned. Someone from Kentucky was going to paint their history. But there was no chance with Tom Lea, who had been trained so well. He won the competition. But if you'll notice, you have everything extending from a cavalry soldier in the coming of Donovan. After the Mexican-American War, he carried the American flag through El Paso the first time. You go all the way to the Vaquero. We have pictures of these people, actually from our region. There was a Chado who posed for him in his studio. The Franciscan friar, you have the Spaniard who brought the horse, actually where we live, in 1598, a man named Don Juan de Oñate, a Spaniard, but born in Mexico, they had mines, came through El Paso del Norte, or the Pass of the North, to colonize New Mexico. And he has horses, which is very tight. Here you have a Spanish barb, all the accoutrements of what the Spaniards, their saddle, their bridle, the spurs on the Spaniards' boots, those jack boots, which, why would they wear those big tall boots out in our area? Well, it's sort of a prickly place with cacti and harsh, but that becomes, this is something that's so interesting about Tom Lea. He's interested in all the parts that make up a whole and how things are appropriated and adapted. So you have the jack boots on the Spaniard that becomes the tooled chaps of a Mexican chado. The first cowboys, of course, were Mexicans. It wasn't cowboys, it was the vaquero. So you have all this, and then you have the breeding of horses. The Indians, he had written a novel about how when the horses came with Spain, how did the Indians get them? And of course, in his novel, the Spaniard says, you keep those Indians on foot, because if you don't, they're going to be the Comanches, they're going to be the Apaches, they're going to beat us on horseback, which they did. So Tom was very interested in how the indigenous people then acquired the horse and how they rode them. Of course, they rode like centaurs. They don't have the saddles and spurs, and they became great, great horsemen, but also the covering of their legs you see in the indigenous people too. And they're all noble people. They're all noble. He always said, I'm interested in the adequacy of humankind, not its inadequacy. And so here you see the Apaches as great trackers, which they were. And then the pioneer couple, you have a Texas Ranger on a quarter horse. The Morgan is the cavalry. You have the Spanish barb, you have a quarter horse, how they bred, King Ranch. That's why when he ends up writing the history of the King Ranch, all these things had been such interest to him. How do you breed horses to do certain things? So you have the Texas Ranger, then a miner and a sheriff, which was his father in the coming of commerce. But anyway, that's a little bit about this mural and gives you a little sense of just his thoroughness and interested in all the parts that make up a whole.
So we touched a little bit on it, but how did they recruit Tom to do the Pieces for Life and then ultimately take this gentleman into combat?
Well, Tom, you know, he'd come back to El Paso. He was very involved in his community, did that mural, was doing illustrations at Mac Light for J. Frank Dobie, very engaged in his own region and communicating his region. He did talk about, you know, sometimes the art world would think, you know, he was sort of podunk because he was regional. And Tom Lea would say, you know, those Italians were as regional as they come, those Italian Renaissance masters. But, so here he is, immersed in his own region. He had actually been at the Grand Canyon. Initially, he got this telegram is from Life, because Life knew, of course, Life was a new publication. They knew that the United States was gearing up for war. And Tom talked about, on the radio, they'd hear, Heil Hitler, Heil Hitler. So here he is, completely immersed. He had gotten a fellowship, a Rosenwald fellowship, to do a whole year, way paid, to do a series of paintings about authentic Southwestern figures and authentic Southwestern landscapes. And he gets a telegram, and they ask him to do a series of portraits that you can read here. And Life just gave him this one assignment. I think here he says, this is the way it all started. He did this. He went to Fort Sam Houston. He did a cavalry soldier at Fort Bliss first. Then he did Fort Sam Houston. I think some of these are in the show. Yeah. These illustrational pieces of a master sergeant at Fort Sam Houston and a mechanic. He was interested in all types of people. He got them in on time. And then after he did that, and he had this fellowship that was going to pay his way for a year, he asked if he got another telegram that asked if he'd like to go to the North Atlantic before we entered the war to cover the North Atlantic patrol, where the United States was protecting ships carrying aid to Britain. So that was the next. He gave up his fellowship. He just turned it in. He was the type of man who he didn't kind of have his life mapped out, but he had these gifts and a desire to communicate, and he had this opportunity to go to World War II. It was the beginning. It was a whole career. Within 5 years, during World War II, that was the beginning.
So, Mike, with a thoroughness of Tom and his studio work, how does he morph into a combat artist, and how did his style or practices change once he got in that scenario?
Well, he had the tools. I mean, he's a tremendous artist. He's a draftsman. When you get to China and you see his calligraphy, I mean, few people, Westerners, can do what he did. So he had all the ability, but I go back to being muy simpático. He could get along with people. He could blend into a unit, and that's what he did. And when he got down to, he had done this drawing of an 8th Cavalryman out of Fort Bliss, and they didn't run it. He still had the sketch, as Adair mentioned, but he said, I think I made some friends up at Life magazine. They didn't run my piece, but I think they like me. And the next thing he knows, they want him to go to San Antonio and paint Getting Ready for War, which he does, with this artilleryman and Randolph Field, which of course is still training aviators today in San Antonio. And that's the way it all started. And the next assignment he gets, though, is it's out of the blue. They want him to go up to the North Atlantic. Should I kind of get into that a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah. They want him to go up to the North Atlantic, and you can run that one. There you are, okay? Tom said they sometimes call this painting Mae West. I guess you can figure that. But he said it just came out of the fog, and there we were. Admiral Bristol is up there running the patrol because we were picking, you know, Roosevelt's walking a tightrope. He doesn't want to get into the war, but he wants to help Lend-Lease is going on and the mid-ocean meeting point, so the English bring the convoys halfway and then we go pick them up and one thing and another. And the Reuben James gets sunk, but we still don't go to war. So it's the fall of 41, and he gets this call from Longwell saying, I want you to go up there and paint the North Atlantic Patrol. And later he asked him, he says, I don't know starboard from port. I never heard of a hawse pipe. Why would you send somebody like me up there? To which Longwell says, I wanted a fresh eye. I didn't want some East Coast yachtsman who thought he knew everything when he got there. So that's who I wanted, and that's exactly what he did. And this is where his ability to make friends, without being sycophantic or anything, as far as I can tell, he just blended in. He became friends, and after the war, one of the destroyer skippers, Eddie Pierce, used to call him up. He said, sometimes I'll admit, he said he called me after he'd had a few, and he called late at night. But he said, we were good friends, and it all started in the North Atlantic. And this set the tone, because what he'd do, as Adair has mentioned, he would do sketches, and then he had to run them by the Navy censors in D.C. So he'd take the sketch, and one of the classics was radar. He'd paint a radar antenna, and they said, nope, you can't have that, Tom, because we don't want to tell people about radar right now. So you'll see these sketches of Tom stamped okay by the Navy. After that, he was up there in the fall, he'd get the approval to paint, he's back in El Paso in his studio, and he starts to come out with a finished product. So this was painted in El Paso and then submitted to Life magazine. And that set the tone for all the trips he took during the war. If you'd like me to continue along that line, or?
I think there's a seminal moment. He was traveling, as Adair said, 100,000 miles, and doing these innocuous, reporting.
Yes.
But then how did he get into the war zone?
Well, I'm sorry. He would use government transportation.
He met a Marine,
yeah.
And the Marine said, if you really want to see what this is about, you need to be with the Marines, embedded with the Marines.
Well, yeah, that came a little bit later when he went up to Peleliu, and he had some serious thoughts about that because he wasn't sure he wanted to get killed, he said. But somewhere between Pearl Harbor, somewhere between San Francisco and Hawaii, he changed his mind and he went out with the 7th Marines up to Peleliu.
But it was here at Argentia that he learned about Pearl Harbor.
He
right?
learned about Pearl Harbor up at Argentia, and he's back home, and so he thinks, well, I know something about the Navy, and despite my preconceived ideas, maybe Longwell will let me go out with him again. So this is when they send him out to the Hornet, which became his favorite ship. And he goes out to the Hornet, and I might mention something. On his way out to Pearl Harbor, he went out on what he called the William Ward Burroughs. He called the Willie Ward. She was a converted Grace liner, had been the Santa Rita doing the run up and down the South American coast. And he got to be friends, typical of Tom, with a water tender, he said, a chief boilerman, who worked down in the basement of the ship. He still said basement, not, down below. So they're going into Pearl, and they're standing by the rail, and this is a Tom Lea story that will illustrate what kind of a guy he was. He's standing by the rail with Butch, his buddy, the water tender, from down in the basement of the ship. And Butch kind of sidles over to him and says, well, Tom, you got anybody you want to beat up on Pearl Harbor? I'm your guy. And Tom looked at him and realized that Butch's idea of a worthwhile liberty was getting into a hell of a fight on Hotel Street in downtown Pearl, So that was what he was like. So he ended up knowing Nimitz, Halsey, painted Chiang Kai-shek, he knew FDR, but he often said that the greatest honor he ever had was being invited to the chief's mess on a rusty tin can in the North Atlantic, because you can't fool the troops. There's no question about that. And that's what made it not easy for him, but he could just be part of the woodwork. He became part of the unit. He was one of them.
For both of you, we've touched a little bit on it, but just how important was this reporting for the country and his role with Life, and why did Life want to get this in front of the people?
Well, Life promised to bring world events into your living room. I think Tom Lea was exceptional in that he didn't really as a war correspondent. And one thing that's interesting to know, why did they send artists and not just photographers? Well, Mac described Argentia Bay and how the fog just lifted. And there, he saw those ships. Well, a photographer couldn't capture things in fog, where a painter could. And as Mac mentioned too, if there were things you couldn't show, an artist could adjust it. And I'm not sure it was Dan Longwell, but someone involved during World War II said, we want a considered truth. And Tom Lea, of course, he had time to think about it. He wasn't a journalist where he had to get it off. He sketched, he thought about things, came back, got them censored, came back and painted. So they really communicate more than a photograph ever could. And he also did spreads. So he was interested in military action. And he could show it. A painter could show that like long distances up in the sky. And because that's what an artist can do. They can cut things out and put them together. You make a collage of the action. But he did these extraordinary series. But I wanted to mention too, Tom was so important too, because artists could choose their own route. They weren't really given, they could request things, but many of them would show blown up buildings around the world. It's kind of a good way to get to travel around the world. Tom Lea did 4 different tours. One, are you going to talk about that? You'll talk about that. He did 4 different tours, but he just brought something to living rooms that no one else did in the same way as he did. And even the price, Tom Lea told me this. He said when the price came out, he wasn't a super patriot. I mean, he showed the reality of war. And he got a letter after the Peleliu paintings came out, from a woman who said, God damn you. And he said, I had no choice but to tell the truth of what I saw.
He is a realist. I mean, no question about it. Although the humanity comes through, because when you think of, everyone knows about Ernie Pyle and the way he covered the war. He's writing about the death of. Does anyone remember the death of Captain Wasco from Belton, Texas? I mean, it's the most moving thing Ernie Pyle wrote. And in a nutshell, Wasco was a company commander, obviously a beloved one, and he's killed on a mountaintop in Italy, and they bring him down on the back of a mule. And Ernie Pyle is there, and they lay out the captain, and he's under a blanket, and men from the unit are coming by and holding his hand, and just, I mean, it brings tears to my eyes right now to think about it. It was one of the most moving pieces to come out of World War II. And we'll see Tom have the same effect. A youngster named Quackenbush on the Hornet affected him much the same way. But, Bill Malden, who came through with the most amazing, irreverent, cartoons, making fun of the officers, not the good officers, but the stuffed shirts. I mean, Malden was amazing in that regard. And some people said, well, we shouldn't have that. He's disrespectful. And one thing and another, Eisenhower said that guy runs anything he wants to print. And it's always seemed a coincidence to me. Maybe the desert breeds these kinds of people, because here's Malden. He's from Phoenix. He's from Arizona, New Mexico. Ernie Pyle is from New Mexico, and Tom's from El Paso. They're kind of in the desert. They're all these people. But one thing Tom did, or did not comment on, he accepted things as they were. He didn't get into the social side of things. On the starboard side of this picture, to use a nautical term, he's on the USS Schenck, what he called the skink, and he's coming home from the North Atlantic Patrol, and they went into some bad weather. So this is down in the wardroom, and the water's running through, and one thing and another. And you'll see people are shooting the breeze and one thing and another, but over on the right side is a mess steward who's black, because they were restricted. Black Americans were restricted in the Navy. The Army can take a lot of pride, I think, in that they were real warriors in the 9th and the 10th Cavalry and the 24th and 25th Infantry, but in the Navy and Marine Corps, they were not. Tom didn't comment on it, he just painted it. He painted what he saw, but that has always, affected me that way. Now, his next ship was the Hornet. He said, I've never seen anything like her. That image stayed with him the rest of his life. He went out to the Hornet from Pearl Harbor with John Hersey, who later wrote A Belle Ferdinand, which won the Pulitzer Prize, and later went into Hiroshima after the war. Could we have the next ones here, Ben? Then on the Hornet, this was one of his favorite aviators, a guy named Al Emerson, Silver Emerson, and he painted him biting his lip. He said Silver used to come back, because he had hair streaked with prematurely gray, but he said so he'd come back from a flight with his lips bloody because he would bite his tongue up there. He was so intense on what he was doing, and that's the way he painted him. Next one. Okay. He saw the wasp blow up, and here is not something he invented, but it's what he saw, because the wasp had been hit, and he's down below the waterline in the ship, and so this tremendous shock comes through the water, and he turns to the guy next to him, the sailor next to him, and he said, "What was that?" And he said, the guy's kind of smiling, and he says, "It wasn't a yellow cab coming in, I'll tell you that." And so he runs up there, goes straight to his battle station on the signal bridge, and glues his eye to the scope, and this is what he sees, because the wasp has been hit. They're escorting Marines who are going into Guadalcanal. It's the fight is on. They went into Guadalcanal in August. This is now September 15th. But the magazine blows. The torpedo, the wasp was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine, and Tom just happened to be on the scope when one of her magazines went, and that's exactly what he saw, and that's the way he painted her.
He initially did it on the back of a pocket chart, right? So
yeah, he did. He painted it on the back of a chart, sketched, and did it. Now, this is where we have Tom Lea's equivalent of Ernie Pyle and Captain Wasco coming down the hill. He left. Captain Mason, the skipper of the Hornet, said, "Well, Tom, you've been out here for almost 2 months. Hersey has already left. He's gone into Guadalcanal to do some work with the Marines." And so Captain Mason said, "I think we're about done for a while, and you might as well go get your paintings done, and get through the sensors." So he leaves the ship on the 21st of October. 5 days later, in the Battle of Santa Cruz, she takes a big hit. Now, this is not a kamikaze. It's too early in the war for that. Who knows what was in the Japanese pilot's mind? He's hit, he's wounded. Did he guide it into the ship? You'd almost think he had to, because moving targets are hard to hit, and the Hornet is moving very quickly. But who knows? In any event, I mentioned that his battle station with Hersey and this young ensign, they are photographed in his ROTC uniform at the University of Washington. Their battle station was up on the signal bridge, and that's where this guy hit. Hersey's off the ship. Tom left 5 days earlier, but Quackenbush is there. Quacky, they called him. And it's a complicated story, but he's terribly burned, but he doesn't die immediately. You hope they had morphine for all these poor guys, because the USS Russell comes alongside, and they know the Hornet is doomed, and they're taking survivors off the ship and wounded. And Quacky, as they called him, is moved to the USS Russell, where through a strange series of events that we don't find out for a long time, Quacky dies on a stretcher, an improvised bunk in the wardroom of the USS Russell. And we have an account of his burial, just like Wasco comes down the hill. The account came after, long after, but a sailor recorded what he did. He said, I sewed the young officer into the bag, and in the bottom of it I had put a 5-inch 38 star shell to weight it down for burial at sea. Tom described Quackenbush, who always made sure the people on watch had sandwiches and coffee, and during general quarters distributed them himself throughout the ship to help the other guys. He loved this young man. He said he had a fine mind and a calm heart, but he went to his rest in the deep with a 5-inch star shell.
Actually, let me interject. So, go back to the death of the wasp. So, that ended up in Life magazine. And what year was it that you toured with Tom on those museum shows?
It was like 1997.
Okay, so at that event, my dad had died, and my mom's escort that night was an attorney from Kingsville, Texas, who actually grew up in the Midwest, but he did a stint as a POW guard with Japanese prisoners. And this evidently had made Life magazine. That Life magazine had made it to the POW camp, and the POW said to Ben, give me something to draw on and I'll make you a picture. And he took another GI's Kissel handkerchief, and he painted this image, or really Crayolas or color pencils or whatever, but there's too many elements of it that you know it has to be. And so the pocket chart study, then he did we talked about this a little bit last night, he did a pencil drawing of this image and went to Pearl to report to Nimitz, and the sentry said, no, you can't advance until I see what you have. And he said, well, I'm sorry, this is for his eyes only. And it took Nimitz to clear him to get him through. But again, I didn't understand this till last night. They didn't want somebody knowing that the ship had, what ships had been sunk. And so they didn't want, slow communication to know that the Wasp had gone down. So then Tom came back to the States, did his color images, one of which ended up at Life, and one, I guess Jim Lee has. And then full circle, it ends up back in the war zone, and a POW paints his handkerchief. This fellow, Ben, said to me that night, he said, I have something you might be interested in, because I had bought the back of the envelope and the pencil drawing. And so I called him, and he goes, I can't remember where I put it. So 6 months later goes by, and evidently he stuffed it in the program for that night, put it on the shelf for later retrieval. But we have it today. But I mean, my point is that we're talking about how it impacted the public, the U.S. public, but it went across the shores too. So that was.
It was a Japanese victory, so that POW would have, Japanese POW. And another interesting thing about style, Tom Lea always said he used the style as subject to man. It looks like a Japanese print, like a woodblock print, the way it's done. So that would have probably been attractive to the Japanese. Not only was it a victory, but he liked the style.
As Jamey mentioned, Tom didn't know about the ship. He didn't know that the Hornet, I mean, he knew the Wasp was down, he saw her go, but it was only when Nimitz told him, he said, you lost your ship last thing.
If you'll go back a couple, can we show where he saw the wake, where, when he left the Hornet, that was a view, this one to the left.
Well, we don't,
yeah.
No, that's when he went out there. I don't think that we have the one where he painted leaving. That's a sketch that you have.
Well, this is the image he showed Admiral Nimitz, and he told Admiral Nimitz, that's the way I think of the Hornet. My ship every day, with the phosphorescent way. But it's when Nimitz saw this drawing, he was going through all Tom Lea's drawings, which are the only visual record of the Hornet's final months, when she was sunk all visual records. But it's when Nimitz saw this that he said, he broke the news to Tom that they'd lost a ship the night before.
Because Tom was very emotional about the ship, as you can imagine. And when I remember the quote, it stayed with me all these years, that when he looks at that drawing, he looked at Nimitz and said, that's the way she is every morning of her life.
That's right.
And Nimitz said, she's gone. She's gone. They sent him out to China. He went all the way around the world, really, to get to China, east about Iceland, and flew across and into England, where he saw one of his high school classmates at a P-47 base, painted Jimmy Doolittle in Italy, into North Africa. There's a wonderful sketch of we just don't have time for all the sketches, but there's a great picture of a P-38 pilot named Jet McNichol, and he's getting the DFC pinned on him, and he's got a Scotch plaid hat on, fairly informal. As a matter of fact, sometimes people will amaze you at their informality. A little off the subject, but General Montgomery, people used to wave at him, and he just waved back at the soldiers. Here's Montgomery, the sternest guy. We couldn't get along with him. Eisenhower couldn't get along with him. Nobody. A great man to serve under, a difficult man to serve alongside, an impossible man to command. They used to talk about that. But everybody used to wave at him, and apparently a guy who had nothing on was bulldozing a road, and he had on maybe a G-string, and he had a top hat on. And Montgomery drove by him in Sicily during the campaign, and the guy waved at him, and he just waved back, and one thing another. And the only thing he did was, the next day he issued an order: top hats will not be worn in the 8th Army. So you got to have a sense of humor, even guys like Montgomery. And even in the sadness of all these things going on, anyway, he went out to China. They sent him out. So he finally gets to China. He goes over the hump and into China. And it takes him a long time, but he has a trial painting with a finance minister, Kung, and one thing and another. And they said, okay, we're going to let you paint Chang. So he gets an hour. Chang puts a clock up there, and then he's going to give him a little time. And it goes a little bit more. And I was talking to Tom at his home in El Paso, and I said, well, how did you get this one year? He says, I asked an inane question. I said, you feel you're under pressure? And he looked at me, he says, are you kidding? Am I under pressure? And he said, well, how did you get it? And he said, I could always grab an image. That's the way he left it. I mean, that's an amazing portrait, and it didn't please Henry Luce. So this is not in the Army Art Collection right now, because Henry Luce wouldn't let it run in the magazine. He says he's made him look like a gangster, and he isn't. Because, Henry Luce was a missionary kid, a Mish kid, as they said, who grew up in China. And he said, Chang doesn't, this is not the real Chang. And so it sits in the Harry Ransom Center down at the University of Texas, Austin right now.
With Madam Chang, too, right?
With Madam Chang's there, too. And
she was delightful.
Much more. But along the way, Luce did have some influence, not just Dan Longwell. He said, I want some pictures, and because he was a missionary kid, he says, I want some pictures of just China. So this is one of the just China pictures that he painted, which he called Grandfather China. And that's why that one is there. It was Henry Luce's request. Yeah.
Okay, so this takes us up to most of the images you saw, but this is about Peleliu and an oral history that you conducted.
Yeah, this was a fellow, Manny Rivas. He went to Bowie High School. You'll meet him. But I read that he was on Peleliu. And so Arturo Flores with the Tom Lea Institute and I went out, and it was really kind of crummy footage. But our current executive director turned it into this video we're now using for curricula on World War II. So.
I'm a twin. I was a twin. And Sal was born 20 seconds before I was born. And Sal and I, we went to Bowie High School. And we were there for 3 years. And then 1941, the war struck. I went overseas with him. It was one of the roughest times in our lives. We were 18 years old. Just that high. Just barely 18. We were already, I would say, we were killers. We were already killers. The first Armenian Division made 5 medals in World War II. Guadalcanal, Cape Lofty, New Britain, Peleliu, Okinawa, and China. And my friend and I made all the medals of the first Division. Peleliu was the first one. In Peleliu, there's an island, which is about 3 miles wide, about 7 miles long. There were 21,000 Marines in there, and about 30,000 Japanese in a small place like that. And my twin brother came in with the first wave, and that wave, I'd say about 40% got killed or wounded in the first wave. When we hit the beach, it was straight blood. They had all their guns zero in on that landing spot. Because that was the only landing spot in the whole island where we could land in according to the time. That was the landing where they got the supplies out of Japan, and we had to use it. So they knew what we were going to do. And it was hard to see your friend being shut down. The blood, the bodies all falling apart. But they were good hand-to-hand fighters, really good hand-to-hand fighters. And they were not afraid to die. We were. We didn't want to go out there and die. And they didn't care. They didn't care to die. They didn't care to die. They were dying for their country. The Japanese used this yelling at us, banzai, banzai, and waving their hands up, going hands up. They were experts on destroying your nerves. Some used to start running. Help, help, mother, mother. And that's what they did. We young kids, 17, 18 years old. We lost 87%. Our troops won't ever kill. 21,000 walked in, like I said. We had about 1,900 walked out. And I was always checking. One thing I did is quick reply. You taking care of yourself, nobody's going to hit you. You taking care of your buddies, see what happens to them. So you always ask me, where's my friend? Because they separated us. We destroyed about 87 to 90% of the Japanese. We killed everybody.
And you said that you remember Tom Lea there, seeing that.
They were kind of all the put in the 7th Regiment. We were fighting in the 7th Regiment. But this side of the island was not secure. They wanted somebody on the side of the island where he was fighting to be secure and be with him at all times. 7th Regiment, right? Even in between. Because they had really had that. They were going after him. They knew that he was. He didn't stay long. But we got to be with him.
I mentioned this last night, but for those that weren't there, Tom's only weapon when he hit that beach was a K-bar knife, supposedly to sharpen his pencil so he could draw. He never drew anything. He was hunkered down. If you, the price and the preliminary of the price is those 3 Marines laying on the beach, and the distance is the mortar that took the life of the Marine. But all he did was survive. And then so all those images you see were from memory. He didn't have any notes. He wasn't able to draw it out. And in fact, again, those 3 Marines, that's Tom's perspective looking in, and the Marine next to him says, "I was there, that's me. There's no other way that scene was replicated anywhere else." And again, that's the true essence of his reporting.
I probably mentioned it last night. We were doing some talking, but James Jones, who wrote From Here to Eternity, I've always thought the movie was better than the book because everybody would like to have a first sergeant like Burt Lancaster, but
or Paul Hilliard.
Yeah, or Paul. But Jones said he can't believe it. He looked at the painting, when he saw the painting, when it came out, he couldn't believe it. And Tom said, that SOB didn't know what he was talking about. He said, "I saw it happen." Tapscott later verified it, and he used a kind of a strange expression. He said, "Mortar fire does some very peculiar things to people." I mean, the Marine's dead on his feet and doesn't know it. And he's just reflex action. He's still moving, but that's what he painted. That's what he painted.
And he also wrote about it. He came back and wrote, and a friend of his, Carl Herzog, they painted a thin little book called Peleliu Landing. And Carl sent away for Marine Dungaree to wrap for the cover. It's a collector's item now. But Jamey, you sent me this Bill O'Reilly's book.
Okay.
They completely lift like half of a page from Tom Lea's writing, and there's absolutely no credit to him about what the experience was like on Peleliu. They said somebody said this. And it was Tom Lea and his ability to use words to really describe what he saw there, including the abject patience of that man falling in this after being hit into the red blood on the white sand.
The book was Killing Japan, one of that O'Reilly series, and I tried to get through to him, finally got through to his ghostwriter, and I put in the subject heading, what did I say? I just drew a blank on the word for...
Give credit where credit's due.
Yeah, well, and Martin somebody. Anyway, I pressed him. I said, that you've absolutely lifted it word for word from his book.
Word for word.
You could have put in this image and it would have told that story, but you gave no attribution. He said, well, according to an eyewitness is what I said. And I pressed him further, and he goes, well, it was just a short piece. So
I'm going to follow up on that. I want you to give me his contact.
When Tom was home in El Paso painting these images, and he took them, the finished images, to New York, and Dan Longwell said, "Print them, but I never want to see them again." I mean, they were so powerful that he couldn't. I mean, those images, and even James Jones said, sometimes Tom could be, he was not a big fan of Tom's totally. He said sometimes he was an illustrator, kind of damning with faint praise, but he says this is a real McCoy, except for that one that he didn't like. But Tom then was waiting. He was waiting to go into Japan because nobody knew what was going to happen. And, of course, John Hersey did go. Clearances were going to be a problem, and they wanted him to have an escort officer and all. He says, "I don't want to do that. I want to go where I want to go." But Hersey went, of course, and wrote Hiroshima. And you have to wonder, what would we have if Tom Lea had gone into Japan in September of 45? But we'll never know.
One thing do we have time? One thing I wanted to mention too, Tom Lea, of course, Peleliu was the last thing he did, and then he comes back, and he said, Tom Lea said he could not rest at home in the love and safety of his family until he finished recording what others had experienced, meaning those paintings from Peleliu. Simultaneously, the New York art world, there was a manifesto written by abstract expressionists who said, and there was sort of this attitude that took over that the world was just too horrible to represent anymore after the atomic bomb, so they all turned in to not represent, creating their own world. But the painting that Tom Lea did after he finishes, if you go back to the very beginning, that one of Sarah in the summertime,
It may be the next painting.
is it in here?
Is it the next one?
Did you have it?
No,
I thought so.
No, it was back.
It's at the beginning, but what he did after, he wanted to get back to his region, but he was all the more appreciative of life. He even wrote on Peleliu. It's at the very beginning. On Peleliu, he wrote about after just the noise and the chaos and the death, how it was just silent. And he said, and then I heard the song of a bird. And when he got back from war, he set Sarah, you saw a picture of his wife, whom he met, a beautiful Sarah. He set her up in this dress that he carried throughout the war. And he said he would look at her longingly. It's back farther. Longingly from around the world. But so when he got home, he posed her in the backyard of their home in that same dress.
I think they've gone all the way back.
I saw it up there. I know you're.
No, it was at the very beginning.
Yeah,
very beginning.
mean,
Oh, it's the video.
before-
Oh, sorry. It was the video. Yeah, thanks. Anyway, can you all remember? She's in this beautiful flower dress, but he painted her as standing in the backyard of her home. He said it was as if lighting a votive.
No. Is that it? Is that all the slides?
No, we got one more.
One more.
Okay.
Well, what's the one more?
From King
That's
Ranch.
it. Okay.
Okay.
So.
I've got to be quiet.
Yeah, well,
we'll find that.
Anyway,
There was one other, and if I get this wrong, Adair, he went to the Wind River on a fishing and hunting trip, and just somebody shot an elk or whatever, and the sound of that bullet hitting that animal, he never hunted again. It was too reminiscent of the battles.
He said nausea just
Yeah.
took over, yeah.
If I may, so I think we've covered what they asked a little bit of what Tom Lea meant to King Ranch, and what I would say is that I think what you've heard today, words thorough, authenticity, and ultimately he put his heart and soul into everything. What was supposed to be a short, they call it monograph? I can't remember the right word, but took him 5 years to write the 2-volume set on King Ranch. He was paid a paltry sum of about $25,000 to do it, and then Uncle Bob Clayburgh felt so badly about that he bought the images from him and paid him a little bit more. But what's important are two things. One is that it has stood the test of time because he wanted it correct. It was heavily annotated and heavily researched, and there's nothing that's been shown to be not true. And so that was important for King Ranch for a lasting piece of work about our history that up to 1953. And the essence of King Ranch, and we'll put up a quote that he gave to Holland McCombs, his chief research, that I'll leave it to you to read, that to me tells the legacy of King Ranch and what it is as an entity or a legacy, really. But before we go there, this is a bull that
In Australia.
Oh,
right?
Australia, and the last thing that Bob Clayburgh did was he asked Tom to go document or illustrate our holdings over there, and he delivered the first copy to Bob while he's in the hospital, and he soon died after that from cancer. But Benjamin, if you can go back to that quote, I think we'll leave it in case.
Thank you to Jamey, Adair, and Mac. Round of applause for our panelists, please. To close out the day, we've got a special. There we go. Sorry, folks. We've got a special opportunity, not just because the museum's named after him, or because he's a champion of our museum in New Orleans, but Paul Hilliard was there in the Pacific, not at Peleliu, but he served our nation honorably during World War II. And with the United States Marine Corps, you may have seen the photo of the SBD Dauntless with the rear gunner. That was Paul's job during World War II. So he's going to say some remarks, and then I'll wrap up the program. But Mr. Paul Hilliard, please.
Thing between you and lunch. Gosh, it's a special privilege. I just wanted to say a little about the generalities. You've heard a lot of specifics, but thinking about America in 1940, a nation of about 132 million, less than half of what we are today, but there were 16 million Americans who wore a uniform between 1940 and 1946, and so 1 out of every 8 Americans served, and it's just a little bit of demographics, but there are about 10 million draftees and about 6 million volunteers. Most of the volunteers, teenagers like myself, and so there was nothing unique about being in the military, and by 1943, when I went in, you felt kind of strange as a healthy, able-bodied male walking around and not being in uniform. And you were concerned that their mothers or daughters or sisters that were looking at you and say, I wonder what the hell is wrong with that guy. Is he a 4F? Is he a draft dodger? So it was not unusual to be in uniform. So they talk a lot about, say, well, Grandpa or Dad never said anything about it. Well, we didn't talk. Nobody talked about it for 40 years because we didn't know anyone who had not worn a uniform in World War II. I didn't. I started college. I'm blessed with the GI Bill. It was the only way I'd ever gotten to college, and. Looking around the room that first day in a University of Wisconsin extension in Kenosha, Wisconsin, I saw a lot of guys go wearing their officers' uniforms, and everybody wore, you couldn't buy clothing, so we all wore the clothing that had been issued during the war. I probably had Marine Corps underwear for 20 years, and with my stenciled name on it. And socks and shirts and everything. So the unusual thing would have been to talk about. I had a friend here in Lafayette for years, and we hunted together, did a couple of business deals together, ate lunch a couple 100 times probably, and after he was dead, and I knew he'd been in the Army, which he said was the dumbest institution on the face of the globe, and he'd been a corporal, and that's on. And then I find out that he was the comedian of Easy Company in Band of Brothers, and so if you look at the classic edition of Stephen Ambrose's book, he has a page in the front attributing to Walter Gordon a lot of what he did. Because it was when he met those guys and crashed the party in New Orleans, which is a reunion of Easy Company, and he met those guys and said, "My God, I got to write a book about these people." And one of them was Walter Gordon, and so later on, the two of them both had homes on the Gulf Coast, and they used to have dinner, Ambrose and Gordon, every Friday night. was there until they fell out because Ambrose drank too much. Gordon didn't drink because he said his dad had drank too much, enough for both of them. And so one night Ambrose was well into it, and he introduced Gordon as a hero, and he starts inviting people over to talk to this former paratrooper. And Gordon got up and left and said, "I'll never eat with you again." But they finally made up. But it was a big war, and I look back on it and say, my God, I had no idea this was such a big deal. 100 million maybe in uniform around the world, and the most deadly, destructive war in history. And but it was an interesting time. I look back on it now after almost a century, and I say, well, you know, when I was 21 years old, I had survived the drought as a farm kid, and the Depression, and the death of my father, the burning of the barn, and the war. And I was 21 years, and I was out of service, and blessed with the GI Bill. So it's, but that's enough. I'm looking forward to a sandwich in about 10 minutes and some oysters. So unless you have some specific question, that's all I have to tell you. Okay? All right.
Jamey, I'm going to bring this to you, sir.
Paul's also a great statistician, but how many days from the day we were attacked to the day we declared victory?
Till what?
The day we declared victory.
Less than 4 years. From December 7th, 41 till August, I guess, 15th, when the Japs said we think we've had enough. And I was home on leave by then. I was fortunate because I spent a year in the Philippines, and we were flying missions out of Mindanao, and they told us that you got 30 minutes. You get in a plane, you're going back to the States you're going back for a reassignment. And I remember one of the gunners saying, "Give me 30 seconds to find my toothbrush. I don't need another damn thing from this place." And so they flew us to Guam and put us on the ship and sent us home. And so I was home on leave when they dropped the bombs, and I didn't have to go back. Sent me to Cherry Point, and I had really a good duty. I was a radioman in transports, and we were hauling show business groups, and one of our pilots was Tyrone Power. So we hauled Jerry Colonna and Virginia Mayo and a whole bunch of other show business people. We're down entertaining people on the bases who were, had 13 million men and a couple 100,000 women in the service, and they're trying to get them out of service, and they're doing it all with typewriters and carbon copies. So everybody was waiting for the ruptured duck that you could wear after you'd been discharged. But it was an interesting period in American history. So I was blessed to be through it, and I was really blessed to be an American in the GI Bill, which the war changed everything in the world, but it sure changed the trajectory of my life. So I have nothing but the gratitude for all the blessings I've seen in my lifetime. And 3 years in the Marine Corps was a small price to pay for that all we have today. So thank you. And, thank you.
Well, thank you to you all for being here with us this morning. This has been enlightening to me. I thought I knew a lot, and that's why I like doing programs like these, because I learn more. Thanks again to Luann, her team, Ben. What a wonderful exhibit. Today is the last day of the exhibit, as Jamey mentioned, but the museum will be open till 5. So get some lunch and then run over to the Hilliard Art Museum, where you get to see the real works that we saw on the screen today. I opportunity for a sneak peek or a private peek last night, and it's really remarkable. I think I looked at it more last night than I did when it was at our museum, but go on down there. We also have copies of the book that is the companion piece for the exhibit on order. So Luann and her team are taking names, and you can get a copy of it when they arrive. Larry, thank you very much to Oates and Marina. This is wonderful, and being able to bring all these people together and provide this free of charge so that more people can learn about this important man, but more importantly, this important subject of World War II. It's an epic story, and it takes a lot of learning to try to get a glimpse into it. Be safe, stay out of the rain, happy carnival, goodbye.